Welcome to the Futurati podcast. I'm Futurist Thomas Fry, and today we're going to discuss something that's very different in the future. But usually I have my co-host Trent Fowler with me. Today I'm going to be doing this one solo. We're both futurists. We're both speakers. We travel around the world giving talks. And so if you're interested, be sure to check us out at futuratipodcast.com. But our guest today is Andy Hine. Andy Hine is a professor at the University of Houston, Texas, and he's a well-known futurist in futurist circles. Um, he's he's studied this whole topic very intently and has been researching what happens beyond capitalism, and not so much as charting a course that this is the way it's absolutely going to be, but actually giving us some understanding of what could happen and what the changes are going to happen along the way. I actually found this to be such a fascinating discussion. He goes into great detail on several of the change agents that we're going to run into along the way. And with that, I think you're going to absolutely love this. Again, check out the book "Imagining After Capitalism." You can find it on Amazon and all the common booksellers. Thank you. So, Andy, how have you been?
I have been wonderful, Tom. It's nice to see you again. It's been a while. I know our paths in the world of futures cross every now and then, and it's nice to cross again.
Yeah, I think the last time was 2017 up in Seattle. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, that was a really interesting event up there. Um, so now you've just written a new book. Can you explain a little bit about the book? And you have kind of an understanding of how capitalism is going to change over the coming years. Can you explain that a little bit?
Absolutely. So the origin story a little bit here is we back in 2012 we had a group of students who were particularly interested by this question. We ran our our spring gathering around it that year. We called it After Capitalism back in 2012. And I started looking at it, I go, "Well, interesting as futurist, good due diligence is we should always be looking at, what's next, what's the next, in this case, economic system." And, as I kinda casually scanned the topic, I would say about 5 years later, right around 2017-ish, I started, like, the heat or the urgency or the volume of the ideas started to go up a little like, "Hey, this is getting a little interesting," right? So, I kinda turned up the volume on the investigation, and indeed, it's like, wow, and I would say to kinda, at the high level, what really struck me is not necessarily that capitalism was bad or as a but it was that the emerging future and what capitalism is good at, we're going to kind of start to go on different paths, right? Like, capitalism, as I say, it did its job. It's good at generating wealth, but, it has, I think as we see some value shifts, some shifts in the nature of society that kind of, generate economic, growth kind of model was gonna be increasingly out of line with where we need it to be.
So, how do you define capitalism?
Yeah, that a good question. I would just say it's actually really the operating system of the world, of most of the world, not all of the world, of most of the world today. Now I use the US as the prime example in the book, but I do look across the globe. But the US is we're kind of like the exemplar of capitalism today. So it's really not just the economic system, but it's the economic system wrapped up into the politics, into the technological regime, and the environmental context. So, if operating system can work as the metaphor, that's really the way I thought of it. That said, I did try to bound the research a little bit around economic ideas first because I didn't want to do the future of everything, which you kind of crept in there a little bit, but tried to say, what are economic thinkers thinking about the future after capitalism?
Okay.
And so that's kind of how there's an economic centricness to the argument, but it is really the whole, if you will, it's the whole enchilada.
Right, right. So as a futurist, I always view myself as my job is to challenge people's assumptions, to be provocative, to stretch people's imaginations. And so when you're thinking of capitalism shifting and changing, what are some of the trigger points that you are assuming will cause it to veer off in a different direction?
Yeah, probably the big 3. I mean, no surprise really. The climate and resource carrying capacity argument. I think there's some questions about how long the growth rate can go, the nature of the growth and the growth rate can go on as it is. So there's definitely some questions we have to ask around that. I think the economic inequality argument, I mean, capitalism does some things well, and it definitely throws off wealth, but the system itself is not really designed to throw that off in a equal fashion, and there's some questions about that. So I think those are the 2. And then the third is really around the whole technological capability is, now that AI has kind of exploded on the scene and it's kind of woken some people up to what's happening, that I think really the while that could I think it could go bad, it's also, amazing capabilities in front of us, and what are we gonna do with those? So I think those are the big 3, right? The environmental question, the equality and inequality question, the distribution question, and then what are we gonna do with all this capability from the tech
Okay.
world?
And then what is the time frame? Has it already started?
I think so. I mean, so in having now tracked it at least lightly for more than a decade, the last 2 or 3 years, maybe 5, depending on how you could see the spike in attention. Now it's not the average person, so to speak, who's talking about the end of capitalism, but in terms of the folks who might be predisposed to think about those questions, you've just seen the end of capitalism articles like that. If you put that search into a Google trend, you just see it spike. And it's been in the last 2, 3, 5 years. And they said before that, it was very sparse volume. There were some people thinking about it, right? And really I would say actually probably even though there is a bunch of end of kind of stuff being written, it's more along the lines of how do we fix it? Like how do we reform it? And to me, one of the interesting, I guess you call it a conclusions, as a futurist, I always want to keep space open for possibilities. But I think the reform thing reforming is a good thing that should be done. Like let's do the best we can in the present. But I think long term, it's like I don't think we can fix it. Like reform it. I think it's just the nature of the beast is such that it is going to break down and we can extend it. I put the time frame for an after capitalism at like 20 to 30 years. So it is not tomorrow. And I think actually that would be a dangerous thing. Like if it collapsed now, which is not out of the question. I mean, I don't think we have any sense of what we would do behind that. I think it would be disastrous.
Okay, so this is kind of a systems thinking approach to how the humanity is going to kind of migrate into the next generations here. Um, what role does cryptocurrency play in this, if any?
Mhm. Sure. So we definitely looked at that, and I think one of the major. So when you get more towards we'll call it the solution space, or what it might actually look like, you see one of the major themes in what others have written. So just to be clear, I'm not making all this up. It's a work of synthesis, right? Where I tried to find like, oh, what are people saying? What's the known state of ideas about what might happen after capitalism, right? And I think the big theme is this kind of decentralized, distributed network, highly local, direct, with some attention to the global. I think there's maybe a little bit of romanticizing of the local, but nonetheless, you get definitely sympathetic that the idea is kind of like this, we got to distribute, and it's what do you call that when you scale it, and then you scale it up, you scale up the local to the global. So in that kind of decentralized distributed future, you could imagine something like crypto blockchain, being like a fundamental enabling mechanism. So I could definitely, so I think any, not just that, but any kinds of you know, decision making criteria, any kinds of technologies that enable that distributed local model to work and connect up and scale up. I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the ideas anyway.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And um, how can you explain kind of how this would change life for the average person 20 years from now?
Sure. So I think number one, well, no, we'll call it number two. So number one is we'd have to think about, if we're in a future in which we have to rethink how the rate and how we're growing, like we have to slow this thing down to kind of keep the planet from overheating. If we'll allow that, which could be its own separate discussion, but I'll say one. So I think the nature of, how we consume, what we consume, like there'll be some material changes in how we do that. But maybe a little more psychologically, how is it different? I really think we are moving towards a quote post-work society. Right? Everyone is kind of screaming, gets a little, but when you look at like, how all the potential from AI and automation, all the and all the actual trends that are happening right now and have been happening for a long time towards the 9 to 5 job as the primary means of sustenance has been going down for a long time.
Yeah.
We're already creeping in that direction, and then, you kinda look at the debate about, well, we're gonna replace people with automation and machines and so on, and if we're intelligent about that, this is really good news. I mean, I actually think that should be our goal. Now, I think people will still have things to do. There is still, quote, work that needs to be done. But this whole notion of the way that we set up our society is you need a full-time, 8 to 5 job to get access to a basic living. I think we're going to increasingly say, well, that's just dumb. I mean, we don't need to do that anymore. we, we still need to do things, but again, why we have this amazing technological capability coming on board. Let's use it wisely. Let's
Good.
let the yeah. So I think that's kind of it will be post work, but I don't think it's going to be this abrupt thing that everybody's just all of a sudden sitting around doing nothing. I think we're going to kind of gradually shift more and more of the work over to the we'll call it the machine world, but the however you want to define that.
All right. Some people are quickly anticipating we're going to be a multi-planet species here. How does that change things? And is that a good thing or not?
But, I will say in the book, I didn't really I figured 20 to 30 years, that's not gonna be like a driving force. There was 2 things that you might find interesting that I thought about including and ultimately, I mean, maybe mention it just a little bit. That and the longevity possibility. I almost put longevity as one of the so I have like 7 key drivers, right? I almost put longevity as number 8 and ultimately just said, "Yeah, I just don't think the time frame works." But I mean, so what's the next thing that has to happen? It won't be me, but somebody else has to write like after capitalism, right? And like, what does that future look like? And yeah, sure. But I don't know. I didn't know if you think we're going to be there in 20 years, but I haven't seen anything that makes me think we're there yet. But in that heading in that direction, sure.
Yeah. Yeah. The longevity thing, there's a lot of hope and a lot of good wishes, but I haven't seen anybody live past 120 yet. So
It's one of the funny things that so early in my career, we had back in the like 1990s, we did a bunch of work on that. Some clients were interested, whatever, and we really dug into the all the schemes about longevity, and we're like, wow, this is way harder than people think. And there wasn't anything that seemed super duper promising, and I haven't kept up with it like thoroughly, but my sense is I still haven't seen anything that makes me go, "Oh yeah, we finally cracked it." Now, I think, absolutely plausible, but it's one of those things that again, it looks like it's tougher than we might have thought.
Hello, this is Trent Fowler, co-host of the Futurati podcast. One of the most common pieces of marketing advice I've come across is to know your audience and give them what they want. One difficulty in podcasting is that it's actually pretty hard to do this. None of the major platforms give us any way to reach out to you, our listeners, to find out what you enjoy about the Futurati podcast and what you'd like to see done differently. So we've decided to record this commercial and ask you directly to reach out to us. Head over to futuratipodcast.com, go to the contact page, and drop us a line. Tell us about your favorite and least favorite episodes, what you'd like to see us cover in the future, and anything else you want us to know. We produce this show for you, and we want your advice so we can make it even better. Thank you.
Right, right. Yeah, just like flying to a different planet and trying to survive on that planet. Um, yeah, I was working on a short story where um, after sending a few crews to Mars, and Elon Musk decided that we needed to develop a tougher species, a human, to live on Mars. Uh, and and so then he proceeds to genetically engineer humans. And um, so all of in my story, at least, all the Martians then will have 4 arms and 6 fingers on every hand. So uh, plus they all have an IQ of over 200. So
Well, I will say this, even though I didn't, again, specifically say, address or put the post Earth kind of into that 20, 30-year time frame. So I had one of the images around called a tech-led abundance, right? So one of the futures that says the key driver is, technology driving an abundance that enables the shift past capitalism, right? And some of the ideas in there. So we had, Kurzweil's, singularity, what's on the other side, although he doesn't really give us much help what it looks like. He just says it's going to be different on the other side. But Harari's, Yuval Harari, he actually did talk a lot in his couple of his books about like the new species, right? Like that you could definitely see that as we, for whatever the reasons are that you could see almost a new species emerging, and that did analyze that because I think it's a very plausible future to consider. So that those ideas, and that's in that 20 to 30 year time frame, and I think that's the transhumanist as well. So those, and it's funny that the tech, kind of the tech driven future images are actually the sharpest of any that I was able to find. Like they've done a better job of kind of like trying to describe what that world looks like. Now, it might be a bit imbalanced towards the tech, but so, I mean, that's what they're doing, right? So if you're doing a tech future, of course, it's going to be a little tech heavy, but they were more developed than like the environmental ones are, a little murky. The kind of the social political ones are really, really murky.
oh yeah, right, right.
We're gonna, have local workers assemblies, and they're gonna solve all the problems. It's like, well, hey, geez, I don't know. You've ever worked in a volunteer association, you know how hard it is to get people to do stuff, right?
Yeah, yeah, that can be challenging for sure. Yeah, you're right. As you're talking through all of the variables you're playing around with, is um, you kind of put them in a giant bucket, and shake it around, and dump it on the table. See what do we have here? What are we working with? And yeah, because each one of them could go off on a weird tangent that nobody's quite anticipating right now. Um, yeah, I mean, just even um, developing some form of VR that's actually useful and compelling to use, that doesn't make people sick. I mean, that's such a big game changer right there. Uh, that uh, give people more realistic understandings of maybe what the future could hold, and being able to actually create visual images of it and that sort of thing. Um, that that could be a big game changer in itself. Um, so now tell me about your book. Is it available right now?
We are literally 3 days away from the public the actual hardcover release. So the ebook's been available from the publisher, but we did it. We were trying to get it, one of those get it ready for Christmas. It didn't quite make it, so we did a soft launch about a month or two ago, and now the hard launch is on February 10th, and we're gonna have a little launch party a few weeks after that. So it's just about there, right? Just about there.
Okay. All right. So are you gonna have a big throw a big bash? Uh,
Yeah, well, we'll see if it's big, but yeah, we'll do a virtual kind of launch. We're gonna have I'll talk a little bit. We have a little panel that's gonna talk, but it's like an hour long thing. So I'd be happy to provide a link to that. But that's the launch piece. Yeah, I've been talking about this forever. So I think the people who are in my greater circle are like, for God's sakes, we get this thing. And it took a long, but that's in a sense, I'm kind of glad I didn't. Part of me wishes I got it out 5 years earlier, because then I could have looked smarter that I was ahead of the game. Because now there has been a fair bit of scholarship, a fair bit of publications the last 5 years,
right.
on aspects of this. What I hope to bring to the party, right? Because, you always say, "Well, why this thing compared to some others?" And you've probably seen this as well, is so many of the books about the future are written by very smart people,
Right.
but it's often very smart people who are just giving you their very smart opinions, and there's often not a whole lot of rigor in terms of methodology. Now,
Right.
uh, y- to me, so what I wanted to throw into the mix is saying, all right, using a rigorous foresight methodology, what does that future look like? And just if you will, kind of compare the differences. Not that it's better or anything, but just to kind of be able to say, like, we got to this to three pretty provocative images, and if people look at that and go, "Well, wait a minute, where did that come from?" Being able to trace it back and say, "All right, well, like that's I think one of the things that I really like about foresight work." And I've done 2 trainings in the last couple of weeks with brand new groups, and when you try to say, "Well, why?" Make them slog through all this work, and by the end of the time, they're like, "Oh my god, I'm so exhausted." And it's like, well, look, we want you to do that enough rigorous research such that if you propose a provocative future and someone comes at you and says this is BS, you can prove, you can make your case, you can back it up. I've done the work. Here's the chain of custody. Here's this scenario came from this set of drivers. This set of drivers came from these trends. These trends came from these scan hits, and like we can kind of trace all the way back, so that and that's what I wanted to show in this book. This wasn't a bunch of made up poofery about what might happen. It's like there are, there's at least some evidence, and there's a plausible case for how it hangs together. So that's kind of what I wanted to throw into the mix. And again, it is a work of synthesis. So these ideas are out there, and there's a lot of people that are thinking about aspects of what could the post-capitalist future look like. So uh,
Okay. So yeah, talk a little bit about the role of energy in all of this, because energy is such a major factor. I did a talk a few months ago for Berkshire Hathaway in Las Vegas. We were talking about the future of energy, and I showed some screens where what people thought of energy back in 1850, and then how that changed when it got to 1900, and then 1950, and then 2000, and what are people going to think as what constitutes energy in 2050. And it's kind of interesting seeing that just the visual changes that we've gone through as we think about energy. We've gone from oil derricks and steam engines to power lines, and now we may have space-based power stations and fusion energy. Maybe we'll see.
right.
It's always been 10 years out, so I'm always waiting to reach that 10 years yet.
Well, this it's the value of not only being a futurist, but like you and I, we've been doing this work for a long time. So you get to actually see kind of the early seeds of an idea, and how does it, literally watch it go from kind of the drawing board into reality. And I was just thinking when you mentioned the point about virtual reality, and it brought up I always think I went and visited the first, I guess, is one of the first caves, the VR caves. Remember, you go into the room and then you walk around in the headset, and half the people ended up puking. The other half were like, where am I? But it was like really cool. And this was like, I don't know, at early 2000s, I think. And, we've seen like VR, like many, not all technologies, but a lot of technologies go through those phases, right? They try to make it into the mainstream, not quite ready, go back to the drawing board, come back 10 years later, try again, right? And we know, I think, just from history and being a history of the future, that sometimes it can take many iterations before something finally makes it over the hump, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that we have to be careful of is just because it didn't make it this time doesn't mean, we won't, if you will, fix what got in the way the last time. So I think in terms of the energy, like, I'll just say it, one of my for years, I've always been a fuel cell guy. The fuel cell versus batteries, I remember looking at it early on, I go, fuel cells have got to win. Hydrogen's gonna win in the long term, doesn't it? And so still going on. Well, one of these days, right? Because I still believe it's the better, the long term, better long term, at least better than batteries, right? So, but not you do see, and just it's almost like, again, in the futures literature, we were talking about a hydrogen economy forever, and mainstream really hasn't paid much attention. But I'd say in the last few years, those ideas are starting to come back again.
Right.
And, could you plug a hydrogen economy into this sort of, again, I think, to me, I always look at that. Can you do that sort of local distributed networks kind of approach? And that seems to be if you will, the way of not just of almost anything, right? And I would include that with energy. We just did a little study for a foundation around sustainable energy, and we really did a lot of looking at these off the grid solutions, and like there's all these little experiments that are happening, right? And that's what we know, those kind of early signs, those early weak signals, and we're starting to learn like how might that work now. If you mention that to a mainstream sort of energy person, "Oh, I'll never scale," right? They'll immediately shoot it down, but we know better, and just to say, like, there are some really interesting, again, to me, the kind of criteria I'd be thinking about is that sort of local distributed, low impact, right, kind of future. And to your point, we did, about, like, fusion. When we did our we said, "Hey, you better keep your eyes on this because it's finally it's getting interesting." Yes, it's always been 50 years away, but, maybe we're finally hit it because there's been finally some really interesting breakthroughs in the last few years. Now we're getting net positive, like, "Ooh, now." So let's keep our eyes on that, but, again, I think that overall, the local distributed networked approach is probably where I'd put most of my chips.
Yeah. Yeah.
Are you enjoying this episode of the Futurati podcast? If so, please like it, give the show a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and share it with your friends. By far, the best way to help us grow is to spread the word on social media, which will expose our content to more people and help us continue to bring you interviews with world-leading experts in AI, quantum computing, cryptocurrencies, and so much more. Thank you in advance.
Yeah, I know, when Elon Musk built his AI supercomputer in Memphis there, he had to get a um, special allocation of energy from the Tennessee Valley Authority to power that thing. Um, I don't know if they've still got it up to full speed or not, but, it's
Yeah.
it's, it's a major power thing for sure.
And doesn't it seem like those are just like they're kind of, you can understand the short term reason why, but in the big picture, like anything that requires, like, we gotta spend trillions of dollars to create the power to do X. It's like, oh, this is not the direction maybe that we should be heading in, right?
Yeah, well, it's kind of a awakening when DeepSeek come to along, and suddenly we can do it with a lot less energy. Um,
Right, right.
yeah, so, yeah, I mean, it was that way with, their early cars as well. Um,
Oh,
I always have to remind people that, the cars that we drive today have actually been in development for over 120 years. And so it's taken that long to get to cars that are this good. So with each of these technologies, if we continue to refine and continue to develop, then they turn into something vastly different than what was originally started with. And so whether it's yeah, like I mean the first VR was actually what 1947 with Dennis Gabor. Uh,
Yes.
yeah, and we still haven't solved that problem. How do we how do we visualize in 3D yet? Um, so that seemed like an easier problem to solve than it, but it's taken a long time. So these are things that you can't just map out on a grid line and say, well, based on these data points, we're going to be there by X. We're going to be there at 10 years. And because some of these intractable problems take a long, long time before we figure out a solution for them. Yeah, I think that's where it gets really interesting. And so um, yeah, going back to what what capitalism looks like, let's say 20 years from now, um, it it seems to me that with AI, it opens the doors for lots of new businesses, lots of new industries, because it'll be so much easier to start a new business. And um, each one of these has the potential to take off and spring to life on its own. Um, so I don't see the massive amounts of unemployment that most people would see. It seems to me that we're going to create things to do. I think we're going to have a lot of people that are interested in creating new things. So, um, can you speak to that a little bit?
Absolutely. So I think, one of the fundamental questions, and it wasn't I just borrowed it from somebody else. And I first heard it from Robert Reich, and I can't remember. I must have heard it on an NPR interview 20 years ago. And then recently I read Carl Polanyi's book on the Great Transformation, and he had it in there too. And it's just the idea was, the why. So our in their both of their points was we have created an economy, but shouldn't we be creating a society? Would you rather live in an economy or a society, right? So it's like we've got the economy ought to be the end, or sorry, the means to the end of a better society. We've kind of flipped it around that we have created, the society exists to serve the economy. And I think what the great potential ahead is to say, all right, let's step back. We've gotten pretty good at produce. Now there's still a lot to do. I mean, let's talk about, we've got million, hundred billions literally of people in the global south that are still not being served properly. So there's lots of work still to be done, but in a sense, we've figured out how to produce the wealth pretty well. We just haven't figured out how to distribute it. So the economy part, we're doing a pretty good job there, right? We know how to do that piece, but it's become almost, instead of again being the means to the end, it's become the end of itself. And I think if you, like, to your point, if we sit back and say, all right, what do we want to be doing? People have lots of creative ideas on what they want to do. And right now, you have to figure out a way to put it into that sort of economic frame. Excuse me. And, I think in the post-work, post-capitalist society, you could take that same innovative entrepreneurial instinct and still act upon it. And I think people will want to do things like that, but not have to figure out how do I get it through, if you will, get it through kind of the capitalist gauntlet. So I think, again, I think those instincts won't go away. It's just the system for how that comes to fruition. So, like, again, weak signals, things like the gift economy. What was the first one where you could pitch your proposals and they'd fund it, right? That idea of, I have an interesting idea and hey, people, will you fund me? And we'll fund you just because it's an interesting idea. I mean, like, certainly it's a small scale thing, but I think that's the kind of sign, like, yeah, that's the direction we want to go. Right. So now, again, the practicalities of shifting a massive $1 trillion global economy to something like GoFundMe, right? That's a big shift, but I mean, I think that's the 20 or 30-year challenge ahead of us. How do we shift into that world?
So, maybe spend just a couple minutes just talking about you mentioned the post-work economy,
Mm.
um, and uh, kind of how do you think through that? And it seems like we're always going to have things to do, um, and we'll certainly define work differently in the future. But how do you think about a post-work economy?
All right, I got three little themes there on this one that I think might be interesting. The most practical of the three is, so I remember as a young futurist saying, looking at the future and going, well, our economic goal was full employment, and thinking, well, shouldn't the goal be full unemployment, right? Like, I mean, should that be the goal? Right. Maybe it's not practical, but ultimately someday we don't want to. Do we really want to work? No. We want to have the wealth, right? And saying that, the first few times I said that in public, going, all right, if I want to kill my career, I'm going to stay on this, on this theme, because, people are just like, what? So, kind of kept that quiet for, the next 20 years. And then, the US, the last two, not the most recent election, but the election before that, having a presidential candidate run on a UBI, Universal Basic Income platform. Like, oh my God, like that was heresy 10 years before that. And, obviously it's still a pretty fringe idea, but the fact that now I don't necessarily think universal basic income is the answer, but it's one of those things that's a rallying cry, kind of like sustainability. Like we were talking about a lot of environmental things, and then the sustainability idea comes out, people go, ah, and that becomes kind of the framer of the conversation. And I think that's what UBI is. It's kind of that framer of what does the redistributed world look like, even if that's not the answer. So the fact that that's there is actually, to me, is that's a sign we've hit another milestone, right? But to kind of take it into the future a little bit, there's two science fiction works that I think really that actually created really interesting images for how we might get there. The first was Cory Doctorow's Walkaway. And so yeah, he talked about this idea that how does it happen? Well, people just start to like kind of check out and they walk away from the existing system and kind of start to construct if you will, an alternative economy alongside that. Now, that kind of happens in a pretty, almost in an apocalyptic backdrop. But nonetheless, that's this idea that we just kind of, if you will, walk away, right? Maybe even more interesting, a little more tangible. Carl Schroeder, who's actually a sci-fi writer, but also a degreed futurist from the OCAD program up in Toronto, wrote a book called Stealing Worlds, and he talks about how the gaming, if you will, the gaming economy, the gaming world kind of builds its own little economy, and that own little economy starts to expand out into the real world. And it's eventually at some point the alternative gaming economy becomes bigger than the real economy. And there's some a little bit of science fiction, but it's actually it's a very plausible scenario. So again, I think that the emergence is kind of alongside. I don't think it's like we have system A and then system B comes and just knocks it out. That we see these alternatives kind of growing up alongside and gradually taking bites out of the mainstream beast. And then, at some point it's like, well, what's left, right? So don't really, and again, that's why I was saying I hope it's not a collapse. Like this system collapsed, is we need, we need a wholesale replacement, because I just don't see that we have anything already on that kind of a scale. So I think the gradual alternatives alongside approach is kind of actually the hopeful pathway to this world.
So I've made a lot of trips over to South Korea, And you're probably aware that South Korea's got one of the lowest birth rates of any country in the world. And I love to ask this question, will robots replace the kids we're not having?
Mm.
Um, and I thought I would just pose that question to you and see uh, kind of how does this shake out in terms of um, kind of a uh, capitalism of the future, how that works.
Well, all right. So maybe it's a good question. I didn't address it directly. I mean, I did talk about, could automation, robotics essentially, do some of that work that in the post work world that the humans aren't doing. So I think that's the case. But I guess I would step back and think about like the population question, how many people should we have? And I know you've lived through it. I've lived through oh my God, we're going to have too many people. The world's going to collapse. We're going to have 15 billion people and the world's going to collapse. And then, so like if you will, we kind of addressed that issue and have, I think, stabilizing at a relatively manageable number. I think the latest is, 10 or 11 billion people is where the current models say we stabilize, right? And to me, that's great news, great success. We've got it under control. We're starting to kind of get back in balance with, what the ecosystem can support. So to me, I'm personally not worried about replacing people. Like low birth rates to me is actually a pretty sensible approach. So and I think if even if there is now we've seen some decline, I've seen some declines. I'm sure you've seen the models as well. Like, China could be, 50 years from now, half as big as it is. Which,
Right.
that's a pretty but even then, so what? I mean, in the sense, like you said, well, the economic growth will go down. Well, the amount of economic growth we'll need, it's not like we have to have growth. I mean, the growth ought to be in balance with the people, the size of the population. Now, not to say that we could not, will we have the technology for humanoid robots? Absolutely. No question. I mean, do we have to have them to replace people? No, I don't think we do. I think, again, there's another one where hopefully we make some intelligent choices, right? So
Yeah.
to me, if we had 10 billion people, I don't see that that's a calamity. I think that's actually probably a pretty maybe that's I don't know what that right number is, but what is the number that the Earth can comfortably support? And,
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I love to ask the question, do we live in an overpopulated planet or an underpopulated universe? It's the same question coming from a little different perspective. Um, yeah, so I had written something on the Drake equation because if we had living organisms living on another planet, they would have different day-night cycles. They'd have different oxygen levels, or maybe no oxygen at all. They would be living with different gravities. We'd be living with different threats and different food sources and everything. And so the chances of them looking like humans is virtually zero because of all the variables suddenly change. So so the idea that Star Trek and science fiction has is that we just put a few different characteristics on somebody's face and suddenly they're an alien. Yeah, that's not likely. Um, I had somebody send me some calculations they had done on the Drake equation, and they said based on this size of the universe and this many billions of planets in the universe, um, in all likelihood, the number of populated planets would be a little over 3,000 light years apart. And the SETI program is only set up to scan something like 200 light years in every direction. And so that's why that we haven't discovered anything yet. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. But yeah, so we're a long ways from actually kind of discovering the limits of our capabilities all around here. But when it comes to automation, robots are not a direct replacement for humans. Um, I it may be a situation where a robot would have its own bank account because you don't want something to go wrong and mess up your bank account. So a housewife would send their robot to the grocery store to pick up a few things, so they would use their own bank account to pay for it. Um, but yeah, you don't want it to run off and buy Cuba either. So
Do you need a dynamic and knowledgeable speaker for an event? Thomas Fry and me, Trent Fowler, are both seasoned keynote speakers, able to converse on a wide array of topics to audiences of all sizes and skill levels. Go to the contact page at futuratiPodcast.com to book Thomas or myself today, and let us apply our years of experience in public speaking to make your event a smashing success.
um, so yeah, but if you have robots, they're not generally consumers. Um, they don't have the same set of needs that people do.
Right.
So maybe they create a limited economy, but very little because they just need kind of oil and grease and spare parts and a few things like that. We need food and shelter and comfort and a lot of other things. So yeah, that. Uh, so I've been writing a lot about uh, the robot world we're moving into because I
Okay.
think that's going to happen pretty quickly here. Uh,
Well, if I could, maybe I could jump off on that a little bit because I think there's some interesting themes that came up in the after capitalism search along those lines. And one, so it's probably no accident that I came into the topic and got interested in it right after I had written a book about changing value shifts, the long-term value shifts. I'm like, ooh, these value shifts, that creates a whole different context. And then saying, oh, wait a minute, that economic system is sort of out of line, doesn't seem to be aligned well with that. So that's probably not in that. So value shifts actually becomes a pretty important driver of all this. But along those lines, one of the things as you were talking, I was thinking about, one of the things that we've seen as part of those value shifts is this sort of embrace of changing identities. Now, current current events with notwithstanding, but this sort of, if you will, tolerance, acceptance of difference, which has historically not necessarily been so, right? That this whole sense, we're embracing the idea of alternative identities, how one wants to describe oneself, and like that, all of that has been a relatively recent shift, and it is part of this kind of longer term value shift. So I think when you were saying that thing about maybe the future humans aren't the same, I actually think that we're on the pathway to being quite okay with that. Like right now, it might be like, oh, they're different, right? But I think we're on that path to saying, all right, we're accepting and able to handle that. No, not everybody, but in general, being able to handle that. So I could definitely see that we're kind of moving into that space where it's okay. So I could totally see a world in which we learn to coexist, not only with like it, I would actually say, if you will, non-human species in general. Like another major shift along underneath or alongside that is just we've been extending rights, or at least having the conversation about extending rights to more and more non-human entities, including the environment, right? Animal species, the environment itself. And I think that those two kinds of shifts are basically opening up to the possibility that it's okay for something to be different, and we can actually that's actually valued, right? Not just tolerated, but valued. So I could totally see that future being quite plausible.
right, right. Yeah, one of my recent columns, I talked about the Turing test for humanoid robots, and I guessed that the Turing test would be actually changing a dirty diaper on a baby. Uh, once
Nice.
once they can do that, because that's a tense situation with something pretty delicate and messy, and yeah, so if they can do that, they can do just about anything then. So,
Uh, I like it. Very well done there. That's good.
uh, yeah, I'm not sure I want to be the first one to test out that robot.
Yeah, done done our job there, maybe.
Yeah. Uh, well, this is this is really kind of an eye-opening discussion that you're taking us through here with all of the variables at play and uh, just kind of helping people think through, you know, not just where we're at today, but where we're going and all the different change factors along the way. Um, the things that we think will never change, they're likely going to change. Um, yeah, we were playing around a while back with um, what job titles are there anything that's a forever job title that you might have? Is there such a thing? And um, the only thing we could come up with was maybe a mother or a father. Uh, but other than that, yeah, not nothing really that's going to be around 1,000 years from now.
Teacher, maybe? I don't know.
Maybe, maybe.
Maybe.
Uh, yeah. Well, this is really good. That tell people how to get a copy of your book,
Sure.
and so tell them the full title and where to get it and how to contact you, and let's wrap it up then.
All right. Awesome. Well, I did want to, when you were kind of closing that out, it just made me think of, one of the things I've witnessed as a futurist now at year 35 is this real hunger. You know, for a long time, it's like you try to get people to think about a long-term future, and maybe because we were happier or fatter and happier, we would, whatever. And, now that there's some turbulence, people go, what? And I've noticed it in the clients, like, what's going on? And like the whole, like, vision is actually could be a good thing. Like, so I think we're actually living it, even though there's some turbulence in the last 5 and maybe another 5 or 10 ahead, right? That it may be a period where we're actually going to get creative about, all right, where do we want to go? Because this ain't what we want. So I'm
Right.
kind of, encouraged in a way. So that's I think the timing of the book is good for that, in that sense, that I think people are looking for something. So it's called Imagining After Capitalism. It is available from the publisher Triarchy Press, and I want to plug them because they're a little small independent publisher that does systems thinking books. Can you imagine a worse marketing strategy than systems thinking books? So God bless them, right? And they're really good people, and they put out good work, and they have a nice collection, and I just loved working with them. So they're just, and they're really doing some good work. And I think, obviously it's on Amazon and, all the kind of normal, normal channels there. So, to find me, if you just, I have a little, book website called imaginingaftercapitalism.com. And, I still have my email, publicly listed. So if you want to drop me a note and you just type in Andy Hines, I will definitely pop up and I will, most likely answer.
Okay. All right. Real good. All right. This has been delightful. This has been delightful. Imagining After Capitalism. So make sure you check out Amazon and grab yourself a copy of that. Andy, thanks for coming on the show. This has been truly inspiring. I really appreciate it.
Well, my pleasure. What a bunch of fun, huh?
Yeah, this is great.
All right.
All
All
right.
right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.